Hey, what's up friends? Aaron from Unison here, back with another video. This time today I wanted to go over writing catchy melodies and just go over some tips on how to go and approach melodies and to make them the best that you can. So we're going to be going over 7 different tips today on how to go and build out a full melody and just to make it the strongest it possibly can be. So let's waste no more time and get right into it. Alright, so I'm here inside of Ableton 11. However, you can use any DAW and do exactly all these tips that I'm going to share with you today. So whenever I go and write a melody, typically I like to go and use some chords to go and reference for the melody. You know, if you have no chords, or say you don't really understand music theory too well, if you go and just freely start writing a melody and then try and incorporate it into a song, or even try to go and make a song out of it, it can obviously work. I've done this before, but if you're newer to music, I would highly suggest using a chord progression to reference for your melody. I have here this piano sound, very basic, but it's probably one of the easiest sounds to go and write out melodies, and then obviously you can go and make adjustments later depending on the style you're going for, and obviously sound choice is a huge factor in this, but we'll get into that later. Alright, so when starting out making a chord progression, I usually start with the bass note, and so I'm just going to go ahead and just use my ears and just write something really quickly. Alright, so I have my bass line there. There's a bit of like tension. I definitely like to write in a bit more of like a minor key, or just a key that has that tension in it. Now we'll go ahead and start building out the chords. And so typically when I'm building out chords, I usually will go and just kind of play around with different combinations of notes. So, you know, I might go and lay a note here. If it doesn't sound good, I'll try. Alright, there we go. So that's in harmony, and that is essentially a 7th. So if you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So if you go 7 above, or even 5 above, which would be right here, you just count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That also works too. But this is a bit more in harmony. And then let's see. Alright, so I've laid out my chord progression, and it looks like we're in the key of F major. However, it is a pentatonic mode, so there's a couple of notes that are not in the normal harmonic major scale, and so it sounds like this. So it has a bit of like that sad tone to it, but it also has that like uplifting, that hopeful ending kind of thing, and I really love that combination of sad and uplifting as well. So okay, we got our chord progression, so now we're gonna go ahead and start laying the melody on top. And so this leads into the next tip, and that is rhythm. So we're gonna actually lay out the melody, but I'm just going to focus on the rhythm. So it's kind of like when you're approaching drums, you know, you want to get a sense of rhythm with your drums. Well, it's the same way with your melody. Where you go and you place certain notes in the melody are what are going to make it weak or strong. So I think just figuring out the placement for the notes right now is a good kind of starting place, and then we can figure out the actual notes later. So I'm going to do that now. Alright, so this is a pretty simple rhythm. I just wanted to add a bit of bounce to the melody so it doesn't just feel so like on the grid. And so I just made some simple kind of like triplety notes here like this, and then now I can go ahead and start messing with the actual notes And then as I do that, I'm sure that there will be some changes, but I at least have a general idea of what I want to go for. So let's go ahead and I'm just going to play around with some notes and try and come up with something that I feel is fitting. So one thing I actually wanted to point out quickly is where I'm placing the notes. So at the very beginning, when I started writing the melody, I went ahead and moved up an octave from where I originally wrote the rhythm part. And so what you want to try and focus on is having contrast in where the notes are placed. So typically, you know, when you're writing bass, you want it here in the lower range. When you're writing chords, you don't want them too high, and also you don't want your melody too low. Because if I go and I move the melody down by an octave, it still works, but I think by having this higher up range, it allows for greater contrast, which is really what gets it stuck in your head. Usually higher notes equals more energy and lower notes equals less energy. And so by having those higher notes, again, that is what you kind of aim for to bring that energy and that catchiness to your melody. Now at the same time, if you go too high, it's just going to be piercing and it's not going to sound good. So it's really all about finding the right range for every element in your song. By the way, if you find the content in this video helpful, please consider subscribing to Unison's channel and leave a thumbs up on this video. Alright, so moving on to tip number 3, use repetition in the notes. As you can see, these pretty much repeat. There's just a little varying difference in the rhythm itself, but this rhythm here is the same as this right here, as well as the notes. So there's consistency both in the rhythm as well as in the notes themselves. And then here the notes kind of change up a bit as well as the rhythm does. So that leads to tip number 4, which is call and response. Essentially, you want these first 4 bars to have the beginning phrase, and then these second 4 bars have like a response phrase, and then sometimes at the very end in the 4th bar you'll have like an altering phrase to where it kind of allows for that differing change, but at the same time it still loops back, it circles back to the beginning melody and it makes sense. So think of it like a loop. As if it loops well, then it's going to sound good, and if it doesn't loop well, if it feels too chaotic, and then it's not going to be a good melody. You want things that have that repetition because that's what gets stuck in people's heads. If you're throwing notes all over the place, there's no consistency and it's not going to get stuck in people's heads. So quick example, this is a melody that I wrote very quickly and very messily. It has no repetition, there's no catchiness to it. So everything is in key still, but it just feels like start and stoppy. It just feels like it's jumping all over the place. Nothing is actually repeating. There's some notes that are repeating, but it just isn't as good. All right, now I have an example of a good melody. Now, as you can hear, I did change the chords up a bit just to make it work for the melody that I was writing. So again, like I said, you know, as you start writing out the melody, maybe you're like, oh, I really like this melody. It's not working with the chords. So I'll go back and change the chords. But typically, like when I'm writing melodies or chords and stuff like that, I kind of write it all together, and then I can go and kind of break it down to create a song. But anyways, that's a whole other story. Again, there's that repetition of the same note, you know, as you can see, it's literally happening in these first 3 bars, and then again, second or fourth bar, switch it up, and then rhythm is also the same. I can go and move these around if I wanted to, but I like the consistency once again. Reiterating, consistency is key, and repetition of certain notes is key as well. But as long as it's in key, then it will obviously sound good. All right, now moving on to tip number 5, and that is counter melodies. And counter melodies can make the melody that we have here a bit more complex, but at the same time, it's kind of like a harmony when, like, you know, you have like your one main vocal and then you have like these like backup harmonies that are happening, and so it just is there to accent the main melody. It's not there to take over, to fight with, anything like that. All right, so now let's go ahead and write a counter melody to the original melody that I wrote. Alright, so I've kind of written more of a harmony melody versus an actual counter melody. It still is considered a counter melody, but, you know, like, it's not doing its own thing in terms of rhythm. However, the notes are different, but like I said, it's still a harmony at the same time. So, I mean, it sounds kind of basic or whatever because we've done everything in the same sound. But now this leads me to tip number 6, which is sound. Choosing the sound and using the right sound for each of these different layers essentially can help really diversify the sound palette, but also just make everything have its own space in the song to where it actually, you know, has that depth that we're looking for. All right, so now I've gone ahead and I separated them all out. So I have the chords, the main melody, and then the counter melody. So now we can go ahead and start playing around with some different sounds for each of these, and it'll start to sound a lot more interesting. So I'm gonna go ahead and pull up Serum. Been using that a lot, and so I'm sure I can find something in here or even just make something. So I'm just gonna go into maybe this chill out. We'll look for something in here. Just like a pad. Let's try a pad. So I'm just going to solo just the chords and just focus on the sound for that. Alright, let's go with that for now. You can always change stuff later. So now I do want to add a bass. So I'm just going to go ahead and just copy these lower notes and just paste them into this new clip, and I'm going to drop them down by an octave, and let's look for a bass sound. Alright, so now we've got some sounds chosen for the building blocks, and so now let's go ahead and start looking for something for the main melody. This time I'm going to go ahead and pull up Omnisphere, and we'll look for something in this plugin. Alright, see, I'm thinking of something kind of a bit more bright, like this brass sound that I found here. So then what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to pull up Sound Doctor. I kind of want to mess around with the processing on the sound a bit. And so I'm just going to load that up and look for something. Let's maybe something in melodies. Maybe we'll start with clean. Maybe something like that. And then for the counter melody, don't want something as bright as that sound. Definitely want it to be a bit more of like an accompanying sound. So I'm just going to look for something a bit more subtle, but still backs that brass sound in a nice, pleasant way. Alright, so I've done some changes here. I've moved the main melody up a higher octave just because it was kind of clashing with this counter melody a bit, and I think it just kind of feels a bit more open when I do that as well. And then this counter melody, I don't want it to necessarily come in right away, so I think when I actually start structuring this out, I'll have it come in like halfway through, like a chorus section or drop section type of thing. So I think we have a decent sound palette. I may go in back and change some of these because now I'm thinking differently, now hearing these lead sounds. So it's really just kind of a lot of trial and error in terms of finding the right sound, playing around with the notes until, you know, it feels right. You know, if it feels right, then typically it is right. So, and I feel like I'm getting there, but I'm going to go back and change these chords now. That's the main thing. I feel like could be a bit more brighter now. Alright, so we're getting there. I did go and change up the main melody a bit, so that way it's just a bit more on the grid. Before I was kind of going mainly for rhythm, but thinking about it once, like now I have an idea for the drums and everything too, and so I do want to go ahead and make it a bit more to the grid, a bit more simple, and so this is what I have now for that main melody. Tip number 7, humanizing and finalizing the melody. And so in this final step, we're going to be going through and just adding some variations such as velocity, as well as just ironing out any final kinks, do some processing, you know, just final touches on this. So let's go ahead and dive into that. So we'll go ahead and jump into the melody. Since this is the main melody here, we want these notes to be the most prominent because this is the one that's going to get stuck in the listener's ear. The counter melody is just an accompanying melody. It doesn't need to be the focus at all. So this note here, we could probably bring down volume. Alright, there we go. Now I've gone ahead and done a few more changes to this counter melody here, but now I think that they talk with each other quite well. It's more of a conversation, they're not fighting over each other. And that wraps up today's video. Be sure to go and check out the Unison Sound Doctor plugin, great for processing melodies as well as bass, drums, chords, etc. Be sure to subscribe to the channel as well as leave a thumbs up on this video if you found it helpful. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.